The winter had always been my favorite season. There was something about the way snow blanketed the world, turning even the most mundane landscapes into something magical. It was a season of quiet and reflection, perfect for a family like ours, active and deeply rooted in sports. Yet, as the snowflakes danced outside our window that morning, I couldn't help but feel the growing distance between my husband, James, and the life we had built together. "Mom, you ready?" Ethan's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the door, bundled up in his ski gear, his vibrant energy almost infectious. At 16, Ethan was already a rising star in competitive skiing. His talent, combined with an unwavering dedication, made him a force to be reckoned with. "Almost," I replied, slipping into my coat. "Where's your dad?" Ethan shrugged, his expression neutral. "Still on the phone with work, I think." That was no surprise. James's job had become an ever-growing part of his life, overshadowing everything else. He was a former skier himself, but in recent years, his involvement in Ethan's career had dwindled. It felt like I was carrying the weight of both roles, mother and coach, all on my own. We headed to the car, the crisp air biting against my cheeks. Ethan loaded the gear with practiced ease, and as we drove to the slopes, the silence between us was companionable. He had his earbuds in, nodding along to whatever music fueled his focus, while I kept my eyes on the snow-dusted road. At the resort, the familiar hum of activity greeted us. Parents and children moved about, skis in hand, their faces a mix of determination and excitement. Ethan didn't waste time, heading straight for the lifts after a quick warm-up. I stayed behind as I always did, watching him carve through the fresh powder with effortless grace. He was breathtaking to watch, strong, fearless, and so sure of himself. In those moments, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride that was almost overwhelming. Yet beneath it was a pang of loneliness. James should have been here to see this, to witness the incredible athlete our son was becoming. After the practice session, Ethan joined me for a quick lunch in the lodge. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his blue eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "You're killing it out there," I said, handing him a steaming cup of cocoa. He grinned, his confidence glowing. "Thanks. I think I nailed that last run." "You did. The timing was perfect. But don't forget to watch your balance on the turns. It got a little shaky toward the end." He nodded, taking my advice to heart. Unlike most teenagers, Ethan valued my input. Maybe it was because I'd been his first coach, or perhaps it was the bond we'd forged over years of shared practices and competitions. Either way, he trusted me, and that meant the world. As the day wore on, the slopes grew quieter. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the snowy landscape. Ethan had gone back out for a final run, leaving me alone by the lodge window. My phone buzzed, a text from James. "Running late. Don't wait up for me." I sighed, slipping the phone back into my pocket. It wasn't unexpected, but it still stung. I looked out at Ethan, his silhouette cutting through the snowy terrain with precision. He didn't need his father here, not really. But I couldn't help but feel the absence like a cold wind seeping through the cracks. Later that evening, as we drove home, Ethan broke the silence. "Mom." His voice was hesitant. "Yeah. Do you think Dad even cares about this anymore?" The question caught me off guard, but I knew better than to dismiss his feelings. "I think he does," I said carefully. "He just shows it differently. His job keeps him busy." Ethan didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Sometimes it feels like it's just you and me." I reached over, squeezing his hand. "We're a team, you and me. Always." His smile was small but genuine. "Yeah, we are." That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I thought about what Ethan had said. He was right, it did feel like it was just the two of us. And while I cherished our bond, I couldn't ignore the ache of what was missing. The days began to blur together, marked by Ethan's relentless training schedule and the quiet rhythms of our life in the snowy mountains. Winter seemed eternal, its icy grip unyielding, yet it had a way of sharpening everything. Every decision, every emotion. Ethan's rise in the competitive skiing world had brought him more attention than I'd expected. After one particularly stellar performance, reporters swarmed him at the lodge, their cameras flashing, questions flying. His name began to appear in local sports columns and online articles, accompanied by phrases like future Olympic hopeful and the rising star to watch. But it wasn't just the sports world that noticed him. During one of his post-race interviews, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, approached him with a shy smile. She introduced herself as a journalist from a local magazine, her eyes lingering on Ethan longer than seemed professional. He'd blushed, his usual easy confidence giving way to an awkward charm that surprised me. When we got into the car to leave, I teased him gently. "Looks like someone's got a fan." "Mom," he groaned, but his grin betrayed him. It wasn't the last time I noticed the effect he was having on women. He'd grown into his looks seemingly overnight. His once boyish features had matured into the sharp lines of a man, and his natural charisma was impossible to ignore. At 16, Ethan was beginning to command attention not just for his talent but for who he was becoming. That shift brought with it an unexpected closeness between us. We spent hours together on the slopes, analyzing footage of his runs or planning his next moves in competition. But there were also quiet evenings at home where the line between mother and son began to blur, not inappropriately but in ways that felt deeper, more complex. One such evening, Ethan was in the kitchen helping me cook, a rare moment of domesticity in our otherwise chaotic lives. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air as he handed me a cutting board. "Do you ever miss skiing, Mom?" he asked suddenly. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "I do sometimes. But watching you, it's like living it all over again. You're better than I ever was." He smiled at that, a soft, almost bashful expression I hadn't seen in years. "I wouldn't be where I am without you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I found myself blinking back an unexpected surge of emotion. "You've always had it in you, Ethan. I just helped you find it." He set the knife down and turned to me, his gaze steady. "No, you've done more than that. You've been everything." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged. I reached out, brushing a stray curl from his forehead, and smiled. "That's what moms are for." But as I stepped back, I couldn't shake the lingering warmth in his eyes or the way my pulse had quickened, just slightly. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's training intensified. Sponsors began to take notice, and offers for partnerships and endorsements trickled in. With James still largely absent, it fell on me to navigate these new waters with him. We spent hours together reviewing contracts and negotiating terms, and with each passing day, our bond grew stronger. One evening, after a particularly grueling day on the slopes, Ethan plopped down on the couch beside me, his hair still damp from the shower. "I don't know how you do it," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Juggling everything. Me the house work." I laughed softly. "You make it sound like I'm running a circus." "Well, you kind of are," he teased, his smile lighting up his face. "But seriously, Mom, I don't say it enough." "Thank you." I reached over, squeezing his hand. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. Watching you thrive is all I need." His hand lingered in mine, his grip firm and steady. "You've given up so much for me. You're worth it," I said simply. For a moment we just sat there, the hum of the heater the only sound in the room. There was a closeness between us that felt almost sacred, a connection forged through years of shared struggles and triumphs. Yet beneath it, I could sense something shifting, something neither of us was ready to name. As winter began to wane, the intensity of Ethan's training reached its peak. His coach had entered him into a national competition, a chance for him to prove himself on a larger stage. The pressure was immense, but he handled it with a maturity that made me prouder than ever. The night before the competition, we stayed at a hotel near the venue. Ethan was unusually quiet. his usual pre-race excitement replaced by a contemplative stillness. "Are you nervous?" I asked as we sat in the small, dimly lit room. "A little," he admitted. "But it's more than that. I don't want to let you down." "You could never let me down," I said firmly, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already made me proud." His gaze met mine, and for a moment the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. "I wouldn't be here without you, Mom." Before I could respond, he leaned forward and wrapped me in a hug. It was a gesture so simple, yet it felt monumental. His strength, his warmth, it enveloped me in a way that felt both protective and vulnerable. As he pulled back, his hands lingered on my shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For everything." And in that moment, I saw him not just as my son but as a man who had grown under my care, who had faced the world with unwavering determination, and who, in his own way, had become my equal. Winter had shaped us both, but it was Ethan who had truly transformed. As I watched him step onto the starting line the next day, his shoulders squared and his eyes focused, I realized that my boy had become a man, and I couldn't have been prouder. The roar of the crowd was deafening as Ethan crossed the finish line, his arms thrown into the air in triumph. The bright banner above the course bore the words, "National Skiing Championship," and it seemed to glow brighter against the icy mountain backdrop. He had done it, Ethan had won first place. I stood at the edge of the slope, my hands clasped tightly together, heart pounding in a mix of joy and disbelief. My son, my Ethan, had become a champion. The announcer's voice crackled over the speakers, proclaiming his victory, but the words barely registered. All I could focus on was him. His face alight with exhilaration, the snowflakes clinging to his hair, and the radiant smile that was so rare and so utterly earned. As he stepped down from his skis and was mobbed by reporters, his eyes searched the crowd until they found mine. He broke through the throng, ignoring the cameras and questions, until he was standing in front of me. "Mom," he breathed, his voice shaking with emotion. Before he could say more, I wrapped him in a tight hug, my arms encircling his tall, strong frame. "You did it," I whispered, my voice thick with pride and tears. "You really did it." "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice low and steady, but the intensity in his tone struck me. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, his hands gripping my arms as if to anchor himself. "This is ours, Mom. Not just mine. Ours." The moment stretched between us, and I could feel the weight of his words. 4 years we had been a team, pushing through every challenge together, and now, standing at the pinnacle of his success, he wanted me to know that he hadn't forgotten a single thing. The celebration that evening was more intimate than I expected. Sponsors, coaches, and a few competitors had gathered in the resort's banquet hall to toast the winners. Ethan, however, stuck close to me. He accepted congratulations with grace and humility, but his attention never strayed far from where I was sitting. "Your son is remarkable," one of the sponsors commented, raising a glass in Ethan's direction. "And he clearly has an incredible support system." I smiled politely, murmuring my thanks, but my focus was on Ethan. His gaze met mine across the room, and a small, private smile curved his lips. It was a look that made my chest tighten, a silent acknowledgement of everything we'd been through to reach this moment. When the formalities ended, Ethan and I slipped away to the balcony. The crisp winter air was a welcome relief from the warm, crowded hall, and the stars above seemed brighter than ever. We leaned against the railing, the silence between us comfortable but charged. "You've been quiet," I said, nudging him gently. "Big wins usually call for big celebrations." He shrugged, a boyish grin tugging at his lips. "This is all I need." He glanced at me, his expression softening. "You're all I need." The words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. There was something in his tone, something deeper, more personal, that made my breath catch. "Ethan," I began, unsure of what to say, but he cut me off gently. "I'm serious, Mom." He turned to face me fully, his hands resting lightly on the railing. "You've been my rock through everything. My coach, my cheerleader, my everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "I'll always be here for you," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "That's never going to change." His gaze lingered on mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. Then he smiled, the intensity easing into something softer. "I know." As the weeks passed, Ethan's victory began to ripple outward. His name appeared in articles and magazines. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, and his social media following exploded. Yet through it all, he remained grounded, focused on his training and, more than anything, on our relationship. Our evenings together became sacred, a time to decompress from the chaos of his rising fame. We'd sit by the fire, sipping hot cocoa or tea, and talk about everything and nothing. The bond between us deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ethan opened up about his fears, his dreams, and the pressure he felt to live up to everyone's expectations. One night, as we sat on the couch with the fire crackling softly in the background, he turned to me with a serious expression. "Mom, do you ever feel like you're not enough?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the mug in his hands. "Sometimes I feel like, no matter how much I accomplish, it's never going to be enough for everyone. The sponsors, the fans, even Dad." "Ethan," I said firmly, placing a hand on his knee, "you are more than enough. You've worked harder than anyone I know, and you've earned every bit of success. Don't let anyone, not even your dad, make you doubt yourself." His eyes met mine, and the vulnerability in his expression made my heart ache. "What about you? Am I enough for you?" I leaned forward, cupping his face in my hands. "You are everything to me, Ethan. Always have been, always will be." He exhaled a shaky breath, leaning into my touch. "You're everything to me too, Mom." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was profound. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, my fingers lingering for a moment longer than they should have. "We'll get through this together," I said softly. "Together," he echoed, his voice filled with quiet determination. As winter began to thaw, our bond only grew stronger. Ethan's fame continued to rise, but he never let it change who he was at his core. He remained my son, the boy who had held my hand on the slopes as a child, who had laughed with me over burnt pancakes, who had turned to me for comfort after every scrape and stumble. But now he was also a man who had proven himself on the world stage and who, despite the attention and accolades, had never stopped seeing me as his anchor. And I, in turn, couldn't help but see him not just as my son, but as someone who had become my equal, someone I trusted and cherished in ways that went beyond words. Together we faced the uncertain future ahead, knowing that no matter what came next, we would always have each other. It was a rare afternoon where we had nothing planned. No interviews, no training, just a quiet day at home. The world outside our cabin was still cloaked in winter's embrace, the snow falling gently against the backdrop of tall pine trees. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth made everything feel cozy, like a refuge from the cold. Ethan was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a sports magazine, while I sat nearby with a book I wasn't really reading. I was still thinking about how much had changed over the past few months since his victory. He had grown into himself in ways I hadn't anticipated. More confident, more assured, more mature. I couldn't quite pinpoint when it had happened, but it was undeniable. "Hey, Mom," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. He sat up, his blue eyes sparkling with an idea. "How about we hit the sauna? It's been a while." I looked up from my book, raising an eyebrow. "The sauna? Isn't that more your thing after a workout?" "Yeah, but I figured we could both use some relaxation," he said, shrugging. "You've been stressed lately, and honestly, so have I. It'll be nice." He wasn't wrong. Between managing his burgeoning career and keeping up with everyday life, I could feel the tension in my shoulders and back more acutely than ever. A sauna session sounded tempting. "All right," I said, closing my book. Let me grab my stuff. The sauna was tucked in a corner of our backyard, a small wooden structure that James had installed years ago when Ethan was just a boy. It hadn't seen much use since James had distanced himself from our lives, but Ethan and I had occasionally used it after long days on the slopes. The space was familiar, intimate, a sanctuary from the world. Ethan was already inside when I stepped in, the warm air wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. He had spread out a couple of towels on the bench, the heat bringing a faint sheen to his skin. I settled across from him, leaning back against the wooden wall and letting the warmth seep into my muscles. "This is nice," I murmured, closing my eyes. The tension in my body began to melt away almost immediately. "See, I told you," he said, grinning. "You've been working too hard, Mom." I opened one eye to look at him. "You're one to talk. I can't remember the last time you actually took a day off." He laughed, the sound deep and easy. "'Kay, fair point. But that's why we're here, to unwind." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft hiss of the steam and the gentle crackle of the wood heater the only sounds. I could feel the sweat beginning to bead on my skin, a sign that my body was finally letting go of some of the stress it had been holding onto. After a while, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, I could help with that tension in your shoulders." I opened my eyes, looking at him quizzically. "Help? How?" He shrugged, his tone casual. "I could give you a massage. I've picked up a few tricks from my trainer, for sore muscles and all that. It might help." For a moment I hesitated. The idea was practical, even thoughtful, but there was something about the intimacy of the suggestion that gave me pause. Still, I trusted Ethan implicitly, and the prospect of easing the persistent ache in my shoulders was too tempting to pass up. "All right," I said finally, shifting to sit up straighter. "But don't get cocky. If you're bad at this, I'll let you know." He chuckled, moving to sit behind me on the bench. "Deal." His hands were warm, whether from the sauna or his natural heat, and as he placed them gently on my shoulders, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and comfort. He started slowly, kneading the muscles with practiced ease, his thumbs pressing into the knots with just the right amount of pressure. "Wow," I said, surprised. "You're actually good at this." "Told you," he replied, his tone light but focused. The tension began to melt away under his touch, and I let out a soft sigh of relief. His hands moved expertly, working their way down my upper back and then back up to my neck. The sauna's warmth combined with the massage to create a sense of relaxation I hadn't felt in weeks. "You carry a lot of stress here," he remarked, his voice closer than I expected. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." "It comes with the territory," I said, my voice soft. "But you're right. I need to take better care of myself." "That's what I'm here for," he said, his tone serious. "To take care of you like you've always taken care of me." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten, and I found myself leaning into his touch without meaning to. His hands paused for a moment, resting lightly on my shoulders, before continuing their rhythmic motion. "Ethan," I began, unsure of what I wanted to say. "Yes," he prompted, his tone gentle. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." He didn't reply right away, but his hands stilled, and I felt him lean closer. The weight of his presence was steady, grounding, and for a moment, the world outside the sauna ceased to exist. "You've done more for me than I can ever repay," he said softly. "You're the most important person in my life, Mom. I hope you know that." I turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, and the intensity in his gaze was almost overwhelming. "You don't have to repay me, Ethan. Being your mom has been the greatest privilege of my life." The moment hung between us, charged and unspoken, before he finally leaned back and resumed the massage. But the warmth in his hands and the weight of his words lingered, wrapping around me like a second layer of heat.